We have to keep moving. Gabriel Rosenson, please.
Why is anti-Semitism rising in the UK?
Why is anti-Semitism...
And do you think a certain member of the panel may bear some responsibility for this?
Jonathan Friedland.
Well, like a lot of people, I was very dispirited by these new figures that came out today that showed that anti-Semitic attacks in Britain had risen to the highest figure ever recorded, 1,100 attacks last year. Some people may think that's not such a big figure, but Britain's Jews are a small community, less than 300,000. And it's dispiriting because we know, and we've seen so recently, that these kinds of attacks, and Paris is the example that's in my mind, can lead to murderous consequences. So there's huge fear about that. I don't think Britain, incidentally, is an anti-Semitic country. I don't. The Jewish community, and I'm proudly a member of that community, we've put down deep roots here, and the community has been allowed to thrive. I don't think the country is in any way anti-Semitic, and that's not what people are frightened of, and there is fear. The fear is instead of that kind of Paris scenario, of this murderous death cult, and that's what they are, of individuals who might try to repeat in London or Manchester, where there are large Jewish communities, what was seen in Paris. So the fear is from those handful of those sort of violent jihadist individuals. Now, as to why there may be an increase, and there are these figures that have recorded an increase, there was an upsurge in the numbers last summer when violence resumed in Gaza. And so violence in the Middle East, and the people who keep these figures know this, every time there's violence in the Middle East, it's followed by an increase in anti-Semitic attacks here. Now, why is that? That's because some of the rhetoric around Israel gets so heated and so inflamed that people who can't hold always that distinction in their mind between what's Israel, a country several thousand miles away, and what are Jews, people here.
Oh, well, wait.
They can't always hold that distinction in their mind, and some of that rhetoric spills over. And since you mentioned the person, member of the panel tonight, George Galloway, I know, is on people's minds, and some of what he has said, I know he's usually very careful to draw a distinction between Jews and Israel, but some of the rhetoric he has used on Israel, some of the ideas he's planted on Israel, you know, for example, suggesting that Israel may have been behind the Ukrainian revolution. And there's, you know, I've got the quotes here if that comes a question. Or suggesting, wait a second, or suggesting that that chemical weapons attack in Syria in August 2013, that Al-Qaeda and Israel had teamed up together to stage that operation. If people hear that kind of thing, they and believe that Israel is somehow uniquely the source of all evil in the world, even terrible things that happen miles away, they are going to eventually not be able to contain their fury and lash out even at Jewish targets. Unfortunately, the evidence is there. It happens every time there's trouble in the Middle East. So somebody like George Galloway, who definitely has a following and an audience and has wonderful powers of rhetoric, we've heard them tonight, he and people like him need to exercise great responsibility in this area, because it is incendiary, and it's sensitive, and as we've seen from these figures today, it can lead to hate.
OK. George Galloway.
Well, I see, David, that with characteristic care you have carefully balanced the audience this evening. The question...
Sorry, listen, I'll bring you in.
You can be the lions.
Let Mr. Galloway
speak. You can be the lions. I'll be Daniel. You will not stop me speaking. You will not stop me speaking. You will not stop me speaking, however much you shout. Because when the Charlie Hebdo affair erupted, there were millions of people demanding that freedom of speech should be protected. And no one in Britain will accept the right of those shouting at me now to exclude a British Member of Parliament from the BBC in any constituency in Britain. None of you will. No. I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry that Jonathan Friedland, in what he has just said, has given credence to the absolutely false allegation implicit in the question. You see, I know about political violence. I was assaulted 3 times in 4 months in London. Well, you say I wonder why. This is, of course, making my point. You see, you're in favour of some political violence, but against other political violence. You're in favour of freedom of speech for some people, but not for other people. Not a single, not one single spokesman for the Jewish community, not a single Jewish community newspaper condemned the assaults upon me, which have led to the imprisonment of 1 man and the fining of 2 others.
George, can you
listen,
come?
Did
can
you
you
set
come
me
to
up here?
No, you're not.
Am I on trial
no.
here? Well, let me speak.
Answer the question.
Let me speak. I'm being bayed at by the audience.
All right, George.
I've been directly accused by another panellist. Let me answer.
What he accused you of, and what I'd like you to address, not about how you've been assaulted.
No, I will.
But the conflation between Israel and Jewishness or Jews, which is what actually
this is a dangerous conflation. It's a false synonym. Zionism and Israel are different things from Judaism and Jewishness. And anybody who confuses these 2 things, whether they're an anti-Semite or whether they are so-called leaders of the Jewish community, is making a grave mistake. Now, the Community Safety Trust, as Jonathan has just done, blamed the spike on what Jonathan described as a resumption of violence in Gaza last summer. I think what he meant was the mass murder of 2,136 Palestinians locked up in a prison camp called Gaza. 500 of them children. 500 of them children. He called it... All
right, listen, all right, hold on a second.
He called it a resumption of violence. Other people call it mass murder by Israel. No.
All right, now, George,
never...
Just wait a minute, George. Look, you've got a number of you are just shouting. There are a number of people who I can see who are actually agreeing with what George is saying. I'd like just, George, if you'd pause a moment. Let's hear from you, because you've been shouting there in the corner there.
Thank you.
Make your remarks, and one of the 2 of you who've been shouting. Because I want this to be, which it should be in question time, a reasoned debate, not a shouting match.
Thank you.
You go first.
George, your comments are deliberately provocative. Just last year, you declared Bradford an Israeli free zone. In doing so, what you did is you took a deep-rooted, multifaceted conflict in another area of the world and brought it to the streets of the UK. And as a result of that, you put the British Jewish community on the front line at a very volatile time.
All right. You in the white shirt.
Me?
Yes, you in the white shirt.
Watch. George Galloway sits here and he says he's got nothing to do with anti-Semitism, but when he goes and he encourages Hezbollah in Lebanon, who dance in the streets when Jews are killed in Israel, and he's videos on YouTube handing over cash. He said, this is the money, handed it over to a Hamas official in Gaza, who encouraged and endorsed suicide bombings on Israeli streets, encouraging murder of Jews, then making little grandiose statements on this stage about Jews in London.
Hang on, and the woman behind you. Yes.
I think that with everything that George has said and everything that I have heard of him in Bradford and outside of Bradford, he's always made a clear distinction between Zionism and Israel's foreign policy and not being anti-Semite. And I think, just going back to your point, Jonathan, you used, it seems your favourite word in what you were saying was rhetoric, Israel's rhetoric. A lot of what Israel does is not rhetoric. What George said about Gaza was 100% correct, and you have to accept some of it is factual. Sorry, no.
Let's go on with the discussion. George, we'll come back to you, of course. Christina O'Donnell.
Driving up here to North Finchley, we passed with the taxi it was a synagogue. Police all around it, barbed wire, cameras everywhere. And I thought, and this is a temple where people pray, and it has to be shielded like this and protected like this. What I'm saying is, it's not just the George Galloways among us who may or may not have and I think he has fueled this hostility. There's something going on in the air, and it is anti-Semitic.
All right. George Galloway.
Well, I can't tell you how deeply I and people who support me will resent the course of this part of the program. Anti-Semitism is a foul and virulent form of racism which led in the 1930s and 40s to the Holocaust, the greatest crime in human history. I wasn't born then. I had nothing to do with that. And if I had been born then, I would have been the first in the line at the recruitment office to fight fascism, which was a Christian European phenomenon. Now, everything that's been said with melancholy.
Do you know how many priests and nuns
please,
were
just take your hand off me. Take your hands off me. Everything that's been said here with melancholy about the shadow cast by the rise in anti-Semitism could be said many-fold about the Islamophobia and the fear of Muslims in Britain. The number of attacks on Muslims, on Muslim property, is many times more than these fascistic attacks. It is many times more than these fascistic attacks on Jews and Jewish property. Why can't we? Why can't we all oppose anti-Semitism and Islamophobia? Why can't we oppose not just the attacks on kosher, but the attacks on halal?
Of course,
which
I oppose that too.
UKIP, who are not here tonight, just yesterday said they would ban, meaning that the observant Jews and observant Muslims in this country would have to leave the country. Why can't we unite around issues like that?
All right,
my last point, David, one last point. I beg you, don't conflate Zionism, Israel, and Jews in London. It's a very dangerous thing to do. No, it's a... No.
All right, don't shout. Please don't shout out.
No.
Please don't shout.
Many Jews are not Zionists, and most Zionists are not Jews.
All right.
And it's a very dangerous game that you're playing here. Very, very dangerous.
All right. Can we please...
Do you know how many priests and nuns were
just take your hand off me. Take your hands off me.